Some houses carry silence not as absence but as memory, the kind that clings to music left unfinished and footsteps never spoken of again. At Thornbridge Hall, something still breathes behind locked doors, not a ghost, but a secret waiting for the right ear to hear it. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The envelope bore no crest, no return address, and was sealed with a modest dab of wax, not even a signet. Superintendent Battle had known Colonel Hartley long enough to detect the layered meaning beneath the Colonel's habitually clipped sentences, and this one, written in the Colonel's own stiff hand, held a subtle tremor. My goddaughter is in some discomfort. I would not trouble you with family matters if I did not suspect something misaligned. Best if you came as a guest, that was all. No crime, no allegation, no urgency. Just a sense familiar to Battle of something quietly decaying behind lace curtains. It was not the first time a house called to him before its people did. Battle did not question the letter, nor the timing. The date of the late Sir Hugo Vale's birthday, once marked in the music calendars of Europe, now passed unannounced in the national papers. Still, the Colonel's timing was no coincidence. An anniversary was always a reckoning, of sorts. Battle packed light and without haste. His movements were methodical, the habit of years spent not chasing but waiting. At Paddington he boarded the 807 with a notebook and a thick scarf, the sort of object his wife insisted he carry for all countryside business. As the train pulled out and the fog pressed lightly against the window panes, Battle folded the letter once more and tucked it into the inside pocket of his overcoat. The note had said very little, but something had already begun to echo. Thornbridge Hall revealed itself not with grandeur but with reluctance, a mansion neither decaying nor thriving, its grey stone facade partially obscured by ivy and the long indifference of generations. The gravel drive crunched softly beneath the car's tires, the sound swallowed by the dampness of the surrounding trees. No gardener was visible, the hedges were trimmed, but not recently. The flag above the side turret hung limp in the mist. Battle stepped out without comment, his eyes moving not across the landscape but along the window sills where no curtains twitched, and the heavy brass knocker on the oak door showed no recent polish. The front door opened not to fanfare, but to a butler whose name Battle did not yet know, and whose face bore the worn neutrality of a man long practiced in welcoming guests who should not be asked why they'd come. As he handed over his coat, Battle's eyes rested momentarily on the hallway portrait. Sir Hugo at the piano, head bowed, fingers poised mid-phrase. The man had once been famous, and the house still carried that echo, like the final note of a recital that lingered just above silence. But beneath the varnish and velvet, something had settled that even time would not lift, not absence, but tension unspoken. Miss Caroline Vale stood at the threshold of the drawing-room, neither smiling nor bracing herself. She was not what one would call beautiful, but something in her bearing, quiet, orderly, immaculately neutral, had a way of withholding any judgment before one could form it. She extended a hand with a composure that seemed practiced, and Battle noticed that it was neither cold nor warm but steady. "Superintendent," she said, and then more softly, "You've come on the Colonel's suggestion, I imagine." It was not phrased as a question, but Battle nodded once, permitting the smallest of confirmations. She gestured toward the sitting area, but did not sit. He followed. "There is nothing to report," she said after a pause. Her voice was mild but not evasive. "The family is well. The memorial is tomorrow. We are preparing for guests." She did not meet his eye. That too, Battle observed. It was not fear, nor guilt, nor avoidance. but the deliberate omission of something heavier, a silence designed to protect. He did not press her, that was never his way, but he noted how her gaze flickered toward the far hallway, where the light dimmed slightly, and how she did not mention the music room at all. Some people summoned help, others endured until help arrived without invitation. Caroline Vale, he thought, belonged to the latter. The drawing room had been rearranged, not redecorated, an important distinction in a house where form mattered more than comfort. A harp stood angled in one corner, untouched, its strings dulled with dust. Chairs had been grouped in polite, unnatural shapes, as though conversation could be coaxed into existence by symmetrical furniture. On the mantelpiece, beneath the portrait of Sir Hugo in his youth, someone had placed a single yellow rose in a thin crystal vase. Not fresh, but not entirely faded either. Like everything in Thornbridge Hall, it seemed to hover between presence and absence. Servants moved about with professional constraint, their expressions fixed somewhere between attentiveness and invisibility. Caroline oversaw them quietly, her voice low, her hands never idle. She spoke once to the footman about the wine, once to the cook about timing, and not again. Her movements bore the fatigue of habit, not panic. She had done this before many times, but Battle noticed how she hesitated, just for a moment, before lighting the fire in the drawing room, as though some echo in the hearth had not yet been extinguished. Guests arrived without flourish, a local vicar, a solicitor from the nearby village, a widow in muted silk, whose manner suggested she remembered Sir Hugo more as a myth than a man. They murmured greetings, accepted drinks, and settled into seats with the caution of people unsure whether they had come to grieve, to honor, or merely to be seen. The conversation was shallow and well rehearsed, like a chamber piece played by amateurs, every note correct, and yet the music not quite alive. The corridor was long, carpeted in faded crimson, and lined with portraits that followed the visitor with the disapproval of the well-bred dead. As Caroline walked beside Battle, she kept her eyes ahead, speaking only when necessary. "We've kept most things in their original state," she remarked. It seemed appropriate. At the corridor's far end, a door of dark mahogany stood flanked by two high-backed chairs. No one sat in them. They gave the impression of a forgotten waiting room outside a courtroom or a chapel. Battle slowed slightly as they approached. The brass handle bore a soft sheen from many polishings, but the keyhole was untouched by recent use. Below it, barely visible in the dim light, was a stain, a faint mark no larger than a coin, dark against the wood. A lesser man might have overlooked it. Battle did not. Caroline had stopped walking. She did not look at the mark. "It's been locked since the night he died," she said, her voice composed but flat. "It was his wish that no one disturb the room. My aunt has honored it." Battle made no reply. The hallway was silent, but not still, the kind of silence that held its breath, the kind that knew it had been watched for years. He turned from the door, but his mind did not. Later, as the fire crackled and glasses were refilled with quiet efficiency, Battle remained near the bookcase, listening without appearing to. It was a skill cultivated over decades, letting others perform for one another, while he listened for the notes they avoided. Lady Agnes sat beneath a tall lamp, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. Edward leaned against the mantel, his collar slightly askew, his drink barely touched. Delia perched near the piano, one hand hovering above the keys, not playing, not quite, not playing. Conversation skated over safe surfaces, war years, local politics, the shortcomings of continental conductors. No one mentioned Sir Hugo by name. When they did speak of him, It was always he or my uncle or your father, a pronoun passed like a pebble across water, never allowed to sink. Delia's laugh was too sharp. Edward's silences stretched just a second too long. Caroline, for her part, remained in motion, correcting a cushion here, refilling a glass there, never still, never seated. Battle noted the choreography. This was not a family, this was a quartet, playing a familiar piece in a key they no longer enjoyed. From time to time, a glance would flicker, from Delia to Agnes, from Edward to Caroline, brief, wordless, and charged. Battle did not need to catalogue each one. He knew the sound of rehearsed civility better than most. It always came before the silence broke. They did not speak of it directly, but in the hush that followed dinner, the subject drifted closer like a ship emerging through fog. Battle stood beside a bookshelf of scores and programs, a shelf devoted to Sir Hugo's legacy, when Edward remarked, offhand, "Strange how we never spoke of locking it." Lady Agnes, who had just been served a tisane she would not drink, looked up. "It was understood," she said. No one asked who had understood, or what. Delia said nothing, but her fingers tapped lightly against her wineglass, a rhythm too erratic to be casual. Caroline was folding a linen napkin with particular care. "It was his room," Agnes added. "It ought to remain his." Edward gave a short laugh, not unkind but strained. "And yet, it doesn't feel empty, does it?" Agnes turned to him then, not sharply, deliberately. "Some rooms keep their purpose, even after their occupant has gone." Battle did not speak, but he noted the weight of that line, how it settled over the room like dust on velvet. There had been no formal agreement, no signed instruction. The door had simply remained shut, and no one had questioned why. In that absence of discussion, he recognized something far more binding than consent, guilt, in its quietest form. The drawing-room bore the hush of a museum, though no one had declared it such. Oil portraits lined the far wall, hung with a symmetry that suggested legacy more than affection. Battle stood near the fireplace, his eyes tracing the lineage of the Vale family, as rendered in paint. Narrow shoulders, aquiline noses, the faintest sneer of cultured detachment lingering across each mouth. The oldest portraits wore powdered wigs, the more recent, military decorations or cravats of artistic eccentricity. Sir Hugo's was the largest. He was depicted seated, one hand mid-air above a blurred keyboard, his gaze turned slightly away, as if hearing music no one else could. The effect was cumulative. Not one portrait commanded attention, but together they imposed a presence. These were people who had not been asked for permission in decades, and still expected it. Battle regarded them with the neutrality of a man who had once questioned dukes and dismissed baronets, but he understood what these portraits still whispered to the living, and what the living in turn rehearsed in silence. Lady Agnes Vale entered the room not with grace, but with gravity. She was tall, spare, and perfectly arranged. From the sweep of her grey silk to the modest pin at her collar, her mourning had transitioned long ago into habit, no longer performed but worn like an inherited title. She offered her hand to Battle with a measured cordiality, her voice low, her words exact. There was no sentiment in her welcome, but no coldness either, merely the confidence of a woman who governed a house the way others governed committees. She inquired about the journey. She did not ask why he had come. Her role was not to receive explanations but to maintain the decorum that rendered them unnecessary. Battle answered politely, noting how her fingers tightened ever so slightly when the Colonel's name was mentioned. She made no reference to Caroline's letter, nor to the memorial. Instead, she gestured to the tea service and took her seat beside the fire, where the lamp haloed her silver hair like a crown. When she did speak of Sir Hugo, it was in past perfect. He had loved music. He had admired discipline. He had disliked lateness. Each phrase delivered like a verdict long ago concluded. Battle made no notes. He had learned long ago that grief expressed in order was grief not yet spoken. Edward Vale appeared minutes later, as though reluctantly summoned by the quiet weight of his mother's voice. His presence was thin, not from lack of stature, but from a kind of inward erosion. He was well dressed, but slightly disheveled, the knot of his tie too loose, the cuff of one sleeve turned under. His eyes, beneath dark lashes, had the dulled sheen of someone who had ceased to expect interest, either from others or himself. He greeted Battle with the mild courtesy of a man who had once learned protocol and had since stopped bothering to revise it. There was no rudeness, no warmth, merely distance. His glass was already half full when he took the chair opposite the hearth. He drank not with urgency but with repetition, as though hydration were a matter of rehearsal rather than need. When his mother asked after the cellar, a casual question masked as household management, he replied with a shrug, then a second sip. Battle said little, but he watched the boy, for he still seemed a boy, despite the lines at his temples, and noted the way his gaze flicked briefly toward the window when Hugo's name was mentioned, as if he were already searching for the path away. Delia entered like a chord struck in dissonance. Her steps were quick, her scallop trailing, her cheeks a little too flushed for the hour. She wore a long grey coat, with sleeves rolled up, as though music had left her hands too hot for wool. Her hair was pinned carelessly, as if any further effort would have felt dishonest. She gave Battle a glance and a nod, as though she had heard of him before and didn't quite approve of the timing. Her eyes moved rapidly, to Caroline, to Edward, to the clock on the mantel, and then curiously, to the lid of the piano, which remained closed. When she spoke, it was with the cadence of someone accustomed to an audience, even if only her own reflection. Her voice carried minor notes of irony, especially when referring to family tradition. Hugo would have found all this terribly amusing, she said half to herself. He hated anniversaries, thought they trapped the music. No one replied. She did not sit, but stood by the sideboard and helped herself to wine, declining tea with a raised brow. Caroline passed her without a word. Delia's smile, faint and cool, lingered for a moment longer than it should have. Caroline moved as she always had, between people, between tasks, between silences. She did not carry the air of a servant, nor the authority of a hostess. Rather, she seemed to orbit the others like the weighted pendulum of a grandfather clock, not calling attention to herself, but ensuring that all other parts kept time. Her blouse was plain, her shoes practical, her hands always occupied. She poured tea with practiced grace, folded linen, moved a lamp an inch to the left. No one asked her to. No one thanked her. Delia's eyes followed her once, and in them Battle read something unreadable, not contempt, not envy, but a kind of irritation rooted in familiarity. Edward ignored her entirely. Lady Agnes deferred to her only when something needed doing, and never otherwise. Yet Caroline had the keys, not just to drawers and cabinets, but to timing, to memory. When the fire crackled too low, she added a log. When conversation lagged, she changed the subject, and yet no one saw her. Not truly. Battle watched her closely, not because she acted suspiciously, but because she moved like someone who had grown used to being mistaken for part of the furniture. The mention of the music room came without warning. A casual remark whether the piano should be tuned before the guests arrived. Delia gave a sudden laugh. Why bother? We all know what happens when the music starts. Edward flinched slightly. Caroline lowered her eyes. Lady Agnes stirred her tea, twice clockwise, once counter. No one answered the question. Then Edward, looking away, said, It's locked, isn't it? It is, Caroline said. Delia tilted her glass. Still locked, still sacred. Agnes did not lift her gaze. It was your uncle's wish. Was it? Delia murmured. I must have missed the engraving. There was a pause, thin, metallic. Battle watched each face turn inward. The door had not been mentioned before, but its presence had never left the room. Battle sat still for much of the hour that followed. He accepted tea, declined wine, asked no questions, but he listened to the words spoken and those deliberately avoided. Edward spoke of army days but never of why he left. Delia mentioned rehearsals and invitations, but not the reason she no longer performed. Lady Agnes offered observations about guests, logistics, and flower arrangements, never emotion. Caroline alone moved fluidly through topics, asking others about themselves, offering details without depth, and through it all, Battle measured the rhythm. The conversation had no true tempo. It stuttered, paused, returned like a fugue, losing its shape. Every remark bore the imprint of rehearsal. Every silence throbbed with memory. He noted the small gestures, Delia's fingers twitching when Hugo's compositions were mentioned, Edward refilling a half-empty glass, Agnes watching the fire as though it might speak, Caroline's hands folding a napkin with too much care. The room was warm, the light gentle, the fire steady, but beneath it all lay something unresolved, a discord neither played nor silenced, a memory sealed, not in oak, but in the air they all still breathed. The parlor was hushed in late morning stillness, disturbed only by the faint echo of coal settling in the grate and the rhythmic sweep of Caroline's sleeve as she dusted the lid of the grand piano. It had not been touched in years, at least, not publicly. And even now, she handled it as one might a relic. She moved without hesitation, but with the careful assurance of someone accustomed to handling grief that belonged to other people. The surface bore only a thin veil of dust, as though time out of respect had not dared settle too heavily. She paused briefly before the stool, as though registering some invisible barrier, then lifted the lid with both hands. Inside lay the usual items, sheets of faded manuscript paper, 2 pencils, and a single folded cloth. But among them, almost hidden beneath the padding, was something unexpected, a thin score, handwritten, its top corner curled from pressure rather than age. Caroline hesitated, just long enough to register that this was not where she had left things. Then she lifted the sheet and smoothed it out with one palm. The paper was ordinary, nothing more than a student's manuscript, but there was a tension in the ink, in the way the notes climbed, broken by rests too long and phrases too short. She frowned faintly, lips pressing together, as though the music itself had spoken too soon. The manuscript had no title, the notation was incomplete, stopping midline in the lower register, the tail of a crescendo trailing off without resolution. Yet the hand was elegant, precise, a composer's hand, not a student's. The ink had dried some time ago, but not so long that the paper had yellowed. Beneath the final line of notation, in place of a closing bar, was a phrase, notated in smaller deliberate lettering. It had been circled in firm, deliberate strokes. Silenzio è colpa, silence is guilt. The language was Italian, not unusual in musical circles, and the phrase might have passed as mere poetic embellishment. But the way it had been drawn, with ink laid over itself, circled and recircled, suggested insistence. Not an artist's flourish, but a message. Caroline stood motionless, the page held lightly between her fingers. The silence in the parlor grew colder. Outside, a bird called once and was answered by none. Somewhere behind the walls, a clock ticked, measuring seconds with judicial restraint. She folded the sheet carefully, smoothed the crease, and carried it in both hands as she left the room. Battle stood in the far corner of the library, beneath the tall windows, half obscured by gauze curtains, when Caroline entered. She handed him the manuscript without speech. He accepted it with a slight bow of the head, his fingers enclosing it with the same delicacy she had shown. She lingered only a second more, then departed, the soft thud of the closing door the only acknowledgment of their exchange. He studied the paper in silence. The notation was clearly written, but not uniformly. Certain phrases bore more pressure, the nib digging into the stave lines as though temper had guided the hand more than melody. The choice of intervals was strange, minor thirds oscillating too close together, rhythm erratic, and then the phrase, circled with the sort of insistence that suggested the writer had no faith in being heard. Battle turned the paper slowly. There were no initials, no signature, the edge bore no smudges, no fingerprints that he could see. But the handwriting told him more than ink alone could. It was not a young hand, not a professional one either. Someone educated, someone accustomed to precision, but unfamiliar with performance. His brow furrowed, not in confusion but in slow, silent conclusion. The composition was not meant to be played, it was meant to be read. He folded the paper with quiet deliberation and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. The gesture was unhurried, unhidden, but neither was it declared. There were times when truth had to be protected from interpretation. Battle did not believe in withholding information out of pride, but he had learned over time that revelation was a matter of tempo. Played too soon, it unsettled. Played too late, it was useless. This was neither the moment to ask questions, nor the time to answer them. The house had not yet tuned itself to the key of confession. He stepped to the hearth and added a log to the fire. The movement was simple, almost domestic, but in it lay something watchful. The drawing-room that afternoon bore the taut stillness of a room before a storm. A tray had been brought in, scones, 2 varieties of jam, butter curled into decorative shapes, but no one had touched it. Lady Agnes stood near the French windows, her hands lightly clasped at her waist. She turned only her head when she spoke. I understand someone opened the piano. The room seemed to lean forward. Caroline, standing a few feet behind the tray, replied, "Yes, I thought," but stopped, uncertain whether justification would be considered defiance. Lady Agnes did not raise her voice. "It is not to be opened, not before tomorrow, and not without my consent." Her tone held no anger. It needed none. It carried the weight of old decisions, the kind that had never been spoken, only obeyed. Caroline nodded. "Of course." Agnes turned her gaze back to the garden. "There are things we do out of respect," she said, "more to the air than to the people, and things we do out of necessity. But sometimes the two are not the same." No one responded. The clock in the corner struck 4, and no one moved to pour tea. Delia found it tucked between 2 scores of Chopin, a loose leaf, unmarked, unbound, but deliberately placed. It was not the texture of the paper that startled her, nor the fact that it did not belong to any of the surrounding books. It was the sentence. A single line, printed in plain black ink. The music never stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, sharp and involuntary. She stared at the words as though they might vanish. They did not, nor did they reveal who had written them. She looked up, her eyes sweeping the room, but the library was empty. Beyond the doorway, she could hear Caroline speaking to the maid about linen. From the window came the distant bleat of sheep on the moor. There was nothing to suggest intrusion, nothing to justify fear. Yet she folded the paper into quarters and slid it into her coat pocket with a trembling hand. She did not destroy it, nor did she mention it. When she passed Caroline later in the corridor, she said nothing. But her steps had lost their usual fluidity, her shoulders slightly raised, as though she were walking into wind. The room was warmer that evening, though no one seemed to feel it. The lamps glowed softly against the darkening sky, and the fire burned low, as if trying not to disturb the silence. Delia sat by the piano, her fingers idle on her lap. She had not played. Caroline remained on the far side of the room, folding a linen doily again and again, before finally slipping it into a drawer. They did not speak, but from time to time their eyes met, not in communication, but in recoil. Battle sat with a book he did not read. His attention lay in small things, the way Delia's hands, usually expressive, now curled inward, the way Caroline poured tea without offering it, the way Lady Agnes, silent in her armchair, never once glanced toward the hallway that led to the music room. Conversation drifted and faltered. Edward arrived late and said little. When he reached for his glass, Delia's hand trembled briefly. She steadied it against her skirt. But Battle had already seen. The page had been delivered. The silence had shifted. Not shattered, not yet, but deepened, like a well filling from beneath. And Battle, whose profession was silence, listened. The wind had risen around midnight, dragging branches across the tall windows like fingers against glass. The house, long used to silence, muttered faintly in its beams, and from somewhere, whether within or without, came a low, arrhythmic creaking. Upstairs, most of the household slept, or pretended to. Only Edward moved. He did not move like a man with purpose. He moved like one held aloft by something outside his own will, not urgency, but agitation. In the lower corridor, his footsteps were audible though unhurried, each one echoing a half-second longer than necessary. The door at the end, the one of dark mahogany, was where he stopped. He stood before it for some time, a half-full glass of brandy in one hand, the key in the other. The key should not have existed. It had never been sought, and yet, somehow, Edward had it. Perhaps it had always been his to find. He looked at the lock, muttered something under his breath, and with a motion not quite resolute, inserted the key and turned. The click was soft. The air beyond was heavier, but not stale. He stepped inside, the floorboard sighing beneath him. Later, when asked, he said he had heard music, his father's music. Faint, impossible, but unmistakable. No one had believed him, not fully, but no one had contradicted him either. What mattered more than the claim was the fact that he'd gone in. The room had not changed, and yet something in it was no longer at rest. Dust clung to the velvet of the piano stool, but had been disturbed in a half-circle on the carpet, as though someone had stood there, just long enough. The air carried the faint metallic scent of extinguished fire. The shelves of music remained intact, the scores arranged with the fastidiousness Sir Hugo had always demanded, first by era, then by region, then composer. Edward did not move like a man searching. He moved like one remembering. He stood for some minutes in the center of the room, the brandy untouched in his hand, and looked at the objects as one might look at old friends after a quarrel. The fireplace had once held logs year-round, now it was bare, save for the brittle remains of a fire long dead. On the piano lid stood a single object, a metronome. Its pendulum swayed. It should not have. Edward did not touch it, nor did he speak. He merely watched it tick, as though each motion might strike a chord he had forgotten how to hear. The ticking filled the room, slow and precise, not ominous, not urgent, but intolerably steady, a sound that belonged to the past and insisted upon being noticed. He left the room at some point near dawn, closing the door behind him with a care he had not shown upon entry. The glass of brandy had not been emptied. There is a kind of silence in old houses that does not break with sound. Battle returned to the music room in the still hours of morning, before the rest of the house had stirred. He had not been summoned. He rarely was, but he had noted Edward's expression at breakfast, pale, drawn, and curiously alert. He had noted Caroline's sideways glance, and the tightness of Lady Agnes's voice. Battle walked the corridor alone, and let himself into the room. The air had changed, slightly warmer, slightly disturbed, as though the room had inhaled and not yet exhaled. He stood in the center, his feet planted, his hands in the pockets of his coat. The fireplace held the faintest smudge of soot, not previously visible. One log had been burned, not recently, but more recently than the others. A single glass, rim marked faintly by a lip, stood near the armchair. Battle picked it up and turned it once, noting the angle of the residue. It had been drunk from, but not finished. The sheet of music on the stand had yellowed faintly at the edges. Dust had gathered unevenly across its lower half, as if disturbed by a breath or hand. It was a simple etude, nothing remarkable, but its placement felt deliberate, not for practice, but for memory. He looked at the metronome. It was still ticking. The metronome, constructed of walnut with a brass pendulum, was old, not antique, but used. The varnish on the corners had worn to dullness. Its wind was nearly spent, the motion slowing with each swing. Yet it had run for hours. That much Battle knew. He stepped closer. There was nothing written on it, no note affixed, nothing unusual, save its presence, so centrally placed, so impossibly animated. He neither touched it nor stopped it. Instead, he stood in its rhythm, listening, tick, tock. The room offered no explanation, but Battle did not require one, not yet. It was enough to observe that the object had been wound, which meant without question that someone had entered, not long ago, likely with a purpose. He moved to the piano. Its lid was closed, but not locked. Beneath it, he saw no fresh fingerprints, but a small smudge on the left corner, just enough to betray a touch. He looked around once more. The room had not been ransacked. It had been visited, and something had remained behind. Not a note, not a clue, but an intention, something unresolved, something just beginning to resurface. It was a quiet smell at first, not sharp enough to announce itself, not heavy enough to hang in the air with obvious intention, but once Battle had noticed it, he could not unnotice it. Beneath the dust, beneath the drafts of old varnish and dried leather, came the faintest suggestion of jasmine, faint, but distinct. Feminine, unmistakably so. He turned slightly from the metronome, allowing the scent to settle on his coat sleeve. Jasmine was not natural to the room. It did not belong in Sir Hugo's world, which had always been rooted in austere woods and the faint bitterness of pipe smoke. Nor was it a fragrance one might attribute to furniture polish or stored linens. It lingered not from history, but from recent presence. And more importantly, it had been left unacknowledged. Battle remained still. The scent did not move with the air. It clung instead to something nearby, a velvet cushion, perhaps, or the edge of the music stool. Somewhere, a sleeve had brushed against fabric. Somewhere, someone had leaned close enough to touch the piano's surface, perhaps to whisper, perhaps to listen. It was not the sort of clue that could be measured or photographed. It was the kind that only lingered in memory. That, too, was a kind of evidence. Lady Agnes Vale did not faint with theatricality. She did not clutch at curtains or call for water. She simply folded inward, as though the architecture of her body, long governed by discipline and expectation, had briefly lost its sense of structure. It occurred during the late morning hours, when Caroline, with quiet urgency, informed her that the music room had been entered. Lady Agnes had been seated in the conservatory, a letter half written beside her, and a breakfast tray untouched. Upon hearing the words, "Edward opened the room," she did not respond immediately. She rose, one hand still resting on the table, her shoulders straight. Her mouth opened slightly, as though to speak, but no sound came. Her hand released the edge of the table, and with a gentleness that made it all the more startling, she collapsed onto the stone floor. It was Caroline who caught her. Not a servant, not Delia, not Edward. There was no cry from her lips, no resistance in her limbs. Her fall was as quiet as a curtain drawn in a familiar theatre. When the others came, there was no panic, only the rapid rustle of footsteps, the summoning of salts, a doctor mentioned though not called. Lady Agnes was not unwell, she was merely unguarded. For the first time in years, they gathered in the drawing-room afterwards, a room too bright for mourning, too elegant for apology. Edward remained standing, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on a point just above the fireplace. Delia sat on the edge of the settee, motionless, her fingers loosely clasped. Caroline had gone upstairs with the housemaid. Lady Agnes had not spoken a word since being carried to her room. Battle stood slightly apart. He did not comment on what had happened. He merely watched the shape it left behind. The faint scent of jasmine still lingered on his sleeve. Edward spoke first. "She wasn't angry," he said. "Just," he stopped, uncertain of the word. Delia did not supply one. Battle's eyes moved from one face to another. The silence between them had changed shape. It was no longer about the music room, nor Sir Hugo. It had taken on something older, and perhaps something newer as well. He looked at the armchair Lady Agnes had occupied earlier. A thread at the seam had come loose, perhaps caught by a ring or a button, a small detail. But it had not been there before. None of them mentioned the scent. None of them asked what he had found. But as they drifted into their roles, Edward refilling a glass, Delia looking away, the butler entering with a tray no one would touch, Battle stood quietly and made note of what they avoided. That, more than what they confessed, had always been his map. The lane to Mrs. Blaw's cottage curved gently past a row of hedgerows bowed with rain. The house itself, modest, timber-framed, with flower-pots lining the sill, bore the same air of stubborn neatness its owner had once brought to the silver drawer at Thornbridge Hall. Battle removed his hat before knocking. The gesture wasn't necessary, but habits, like instincts, tended to reward those who kept them. Mrs. Blaw answered the door with a briskness that belied her years. Her hair was pulled into a severe bun, her cardigan was buttoned up to the throat, yet her eyes softened when they met his, as if some distant wartime code of conduct had just been reissued and accepted without fuss. She did not ask why he had come. A kettle had already begun to boil. The tea was served in brown porcelain cups, and accompanied by a tin of ginger biscuits that had, by the looks of them, resisted consumption since Advent. Battle took one, and allowed her the comfort of ritual before he began. It was only when the second cup had cooled slightly, and the silence had grown companionable, that he posed the question, gently phrased, respectfully spaced. The night of Sir Hugo's death, what had she noticed, heard, remembered? Mrs. Blaw stirred her tea once. Slowly. "Miss Delia," she said at last, "was meant to be in London, but I saw her. Her voice was firm, not unkind. Just past 10, maybe nearer 11. She came out of the music room crying. She did not embellish. She did not speculate. But Battle noted the way her fingers curled slightly around the spoon, not with tension, but with something older. Regret, perhaps. Or loyalty, tempered by time. Delia did not flinch at the question. She tilted her chin slightly, as though she had known it would come, and had already rehearsed her refusal. Her voice was cool, not combative. I was in London that night. I had a recital engagement. Battle nodded once, a gesture that invited no contradiction yet suggested none, either. Delia met his gaze evenly. I stayed at the club, dined with Geoffrey Henley and his wife. Returned after midnight. There are letters. I expect you'll want them. Her composure was immaculate, but there was something beneath it. Not fear, not even anger, but a kind of anticipation, as though she were waiting for the next move on a board she understood far too well. Battle said nothing of Mrs. Blore. He simply watched. Delia's hands were folded on her lap, but her right thumb tapped lightly against the side of her index finger, a subtle, almost rhythmic motion, a habit of timing perhaps, or memory. He left the room without pressing further. The denial had been clear. The truth, however, had not. Edward received him in the morning room, the day's paper untouched at his elbow, a cup of coffee going cold on the tray beside him. He looked pale, but not ill. Battle recognized the look, not of physical weakness, but of a man who had begun, quietly, to suspect the house around him. He did not wait for preamble. Father told me, about a week before he died, that he intended to change the will. Said the old one no longer reflected the structure of the family. Battle made no comment. Edward continued, his voice dry. He didn't elaborate. He rarely did, but he mentioned needing to correct certain oversights. That was the phrase. The words hung in the air, not resentfully, but with a kind of dry resignation. Edward took a sip of coffee, grimaced, and put the cup down. No new will was found, he added. After, only the old one, I asked. Caroline said nothing had been touched. Battle inclined his head. And did your father say to whom he intended to leave the house? Edward gave a mirthless smile. He said something about legacy being more than name, which is to say no. There was no bitterness in the remark, but there was an emptiness, carefully folded and worn like an old letter tucked inside a drawer. The report had been typed in the crisp, methodical style of rural coroners, its conclusions brief, its observations conservative, cause of death, cardiac arrest, consistent with hereditary risk, circumstances, no sign of struggle, post-mortem, inconclusive, no further action required. Battle had seen many such reports, the kind that closed more doors than they opened, but this one, folded, and kept in the bottom drawer of the late Sir Hugo's effects, bore a quiet inconsistency. He turned the page again. No mention of external injury, no indication of trauma, but there almost as a parenthetical, trace of dried blood, noted at inner collar right side, not explained, not attributed. He let the page fall back into place, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. Blood, without injury, was always a curiosity, especially in a case deemed natural, a nosebleed perhaps, but there had been no mention of it in testimony, nor evidence of a recurring condition, and if one had occurred, it had not been cleaned. Battle sat back in the chair, fingers steepled lightly. The blood was not a cause, it was a detail, but often in such houses the detail was what revealed the fracture beneath the polished grain. The rose garden, carefully pruned and improbably still, lay to the south of the house, where the gravel paths curved gently between low box hedges and clusters of white floribunda that bowed modestly in the morning breeze. It was a place designed not for conversation but for order, the sort of order that soothed grief when properly maintained. Battle had chosen it deliberately. Caroline was trimming a spent bloom when he approached, her sleeves rolled to the forearms and a straw hat shading her brow. She did not look surprised to see him. If anything, she seemed to anticipate the quiet. He commented first on the health of the lavender, a remark so neutral it could not possibly be mistaken for inquiry. Caroline smiled faintly, not quite amused, and clipped another stem before setting down the shears. Battle asked gently, without tone, if she remembered anything unusual on the night of Sir Hugo's death. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the watering can, poured a narrow stream over the soil, and watched it soak into the earth. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear but low. "I heard voices from the music room. It was late. I was on my way to the linen cupboard." Battle nodded once. "Could you tell who it was?" Caroline hesitated, but only briefly. "I heard Uncle Hugo and someone else. A woman." She was angry. "Did you recognize the voice?" Her hand trembled slightly over the spout, then steadied. "I didn't go closer. It was a lie, of course, not crude, but deliberate, a half-truth constructed to protect." Battle did not challenge it. He had learned to observe not only the words withheld, but the effort it took to withhold them. Caroline Vale, for all her quiet capability, had not grown up inside that house without learning the necessity of silence. And silence, like any inheritance, could be chosen or refused, but never ignored. Later, Battle walked the grounds alone, his steps slow, almost meditative, as he traced the line of the old wall that separated the cultivated earth from the wilder edge of the estate. The path was uneven in places, and the grass had overgrown parts of the flagstones, but there was clarity to be found in the open air that the house could not offer. He had not needed Caroline to name the voice. The timbre of silence was different depending on what it concealed. Hers had not been fear, nor even guilt. It had been protection, raw, reluctant, but resolute. He passed beneath a cluster of rowan trees, and paused at a broken sundial whose shadow pointed east. The Vale family had never liked to discard what could be hidden. The contours of the story were beginning to take shape, not in confession, not in fact, but in the patterns. There was something about the will, something about Delia's position. A woman raised as the chosen heir, the artistic legacy, the public darling, and yet Hugo, it now seemed, had altered course. And Caroline, quietly peripheral, had stepped into a center she never claimed. Battle knelt briefly to examine a half-buried fragment of slate beneath the sundial. Nothing, but it was the act of looking that mattered. As he stood, his gaze drifted back toward the house, symmetrical, proud and withholding. Within its walls lay old decisions and older wounds, but between them, as always, ran a single unbroken thread, silence carefully maintained, and now quietly unraveling. The recital had taken place at Wilford Hall, a Georgian theatre repurposed for wartime fundraising and post-war memory. The program still existed, yellowed now, folded into thirds, kept among a sheaf of clippings in a folder marked Vale Delia Press. Battle received it from the theatre's secretary, a woman who spoke in hushed tones and referred to Delia with the reverence one reserves for the fallen. The date was 6 months after Sir Hugo's death. The piece was the final one of the evening. It had begun with precision, he was told. Not brilliance. Brilliance implied risk, but something colder, sharper, harder. The music had moved through its first bars with deliberate force, as though the pianist were not interpreting but exacting. Then, halfway through the second movement, she faltered. A chord misstruck. A pause too long, not silence but something hollowed, the absence of rhythm mistaken for rest. She had risen, not dramatically but suddenly, and left the stage. The audience waited, then murmured, then stood. She did not return. Battle listened to the account with minimal comment. The secretary's voice grew lower as she described it, the way Delia's eyes had seemed to stare at something invisible beyond the footlights. Not fear, not panic, just refusal. He made no entry in his notebook. The recital had not failed, it had revealed. And Delia, for all her talent, had not played through the grief. She had played into it, and found herself unable to emerge. The composition, Threnody for Silence, was not published. A single copy, typewritten and marked with occasional pencil, sat in the bottom drawer of the library cabinet at Thornbridge Hall. Caroline had handed it to him without ceremony. He never finished it, she had said. Or perhaps he did. No one ever agreed. Battle took the sheet to the reading table. The opening was sparse, with long intervals between notes, not hesitation but restraint. The melody moved tentatively, as though reluctant to assert itself. In the second page, however, came the shift, a sudden dissonance, followed by triplets climbing upward and never resolving. It was less a song than a summons, the dedication, barely legible, penciled in the margin, read per la mia figlia non detta, for my unspoken daughter. He ran his finger lightly along the stave. The notation changed near the end, losing Hugo's familiar script. The final 4 bars had been added by another hand, one firmer, more direct. The key signature did not change, but the intervals closed. It was not a correction, it was a contradiction. The music, Battle thought, was never about mourning, it was about revelation. But in a house like Thornbridge, revelation did not come in speeches. It came in footnotes, in phrasing, in the places where two people left marks over one another's silence. The library bore the hush of ancestral restraint, dark wood, heavier than necessary, and an arrangement of volumes more concerned with inheritance than intellect. Battle had spent enough time in such rooms to know that truth, when it appeared, was not on the shelves but between them. He found the original draft of Threnody by method rather than luck. A folder, unlabeled, tucked beside a collection of Schumann's Lieder, contained sheets not yet filed. The paper was older, the ink faded, but the difference was unmistakable. 2 hands. The first unmistakably Hugo's, precise, florid, leaning slightly rightward. The second, firmer, more upright, bore a calmer touch. Yet the notations it offered were not gentle. They pushed against the original, replaced rests with crescendos, inserted dynamic markings with deliberate, almost stubborn insistence. It was not a collaboration, it was a conversation, or a challenge. The annotations had been made in pencil, perhaps to disguise their permanence, but the message had remained. The line between influence and intrusion blurred on every page. Battle sat for a long while with the pages spread before him, not reading but tracing the rhythm. He did not need to ask whose hand had added the second voice. The line between music and motive was thin, and he had long ago learned to listen for what was meant to remain unheard. The annotation was clean, exact, yet not ornamental. It corrected only what had felt uncertain in Hugo's own phrasing, adjusting phrasing and tempo rather than harmony. It bore no signature, no date. But Battle had seen it before, not in the library, not on music sheets, but on the back of household inventories, on shopping ledgers, in the small square notes pinned to the linen cupboard. It was Caroline's hand. She had written with restraint, but not hesitation. There was something composed in the curvature of her treble clefs, something stubborn in the downward slant of her dynamics. She had not been imitating, she had been interpreting. Battle held the draft beside a note she had left for the cook, a list of ingredients in the same hand. The match was precise, the tilt, the pressure, the way she dotted her as firmly but without affectation. Her annotations in the composition had not sought recognition, but they had sought clarity, the kind of clarity only claimed when something essential had been withheld. The significance was not in the musical correction, it was in the act of correction. This was not a pupil's deference, this was the intervention of someone who believed herself, however quietly, entitled to amend what had been left unfinished. And it was not permission she had received, it was permission she had taken. Caroline did not weep when he told her what he had found. She did not deny it. She sat at the edge of the window seat in the small blue parlor, her hands folded on her skirt, her gaze lowered to the distant green curve of the orchard wall. "My mother was stationed at a convalescent house outside Bath," she said, after a silence so long it had begun to feel like a refusal. "He was recovering from an injury, a hand injury, I think." She never said. They wrote to each other for a while afterward. Then he stopped. Her voice held neither reverence nor bitterness, merely the tempered cadence of someone long accustomed to the taste of withheld truth. He sent money. Not regularly, not always enough, but she kept his letters, until the last one. A pause, he signed it H. Battle did not interrupt. "When I was 14 my mother died. My uncle, Hugo, sent for me. Lady Agnes took one look at me and said, 'She may stay provided she causes no disturbance,' and I never did." There was no pride in the words, only precision, and something else, something colder, a quiet, learned refusal to expect. "He never called me daughter, not once, but he made sure I studied music, gave me access to his library, said I had a useful ear, a faint smile. It was the most praise he ever gave anyone." She looked at Battle then. "Delia found out. Not from me, from him." That was the night she collapsed. She had read the draft, the dedication. Her hands clenched faintly. She said it was a betrayal, that I had taken something that belonged to her. Caroline looked back to the window, "But I never took it. It was never mine to begin with." "She knew before he died," Caroline continued, her voice soft now, yet unflinching. "He told her. I think he meant it as kindness, a way to prepare her, perhaps even to justify the will. But Delia never believed in shared legacies, only exclusive ones." She rose slowly and walked across the room to the escritoire. From one of the drawers she retrieved a small folded piece of paper, brittle at the edges, ink faded. She handed it to Battle without explanation. It was a fragment of the draft, just the final bars in Caroline's hand, a diminuendo, a rest, and then, above the final note, one word in Hugo's own handwriting. "Figlia, daughter." "She found that page in his coat pocket," Caroline said quietly, "after he died. Before the rest of us arrived, she said nothing for days. Then at the recital, she broke." Battle did not ask why Caroline had never spoken. The answer was self-evident. In houses like Thornbridge, silence was not submission. It was strategy and survival. She told him she would never forgive him, that she would not be replaced, not by a shadow. Caroline folded her arms. He thought the music would bridge everything, but it didn't. It simply gave shape to what had already cracked. Battle nodded, his gaze resting now not on the score but on the woman who had lived in the margins of its creation. Delia had not lost her place in Hugo's world. She had discovered that her place had always been conditional, and that someone else, quietly, had already been written in beneath the line. The summons was made with the decorum of a family appointment, not an accusation. No urgency, no cold formality. Only a quiet suggestion passed through the house like the scent of polished oak. One by one they entered the drawing room and took their seats. The arrangement was unchanged. Lady Agnes in her usual chair by the window, Edward upright yet sagging at the shoulders, Delia composed but brittle in her stillness, Caroline poised on the edge of a footstool, her hands folded in her lap. Battle stood near the hearth, not behind the desk, not beside the door. There was no advantage in height, no dominance in posture. His voice when he spoke bore no emphasis, only clarity. This was not theatre, it was a settling of accounts long overdue. He addressed no one in particular, and all of them at once. His tone did not accuse, but neither did it comfort. It placed facts with the measured rhythm of a man laying stones along a path already chosen. He did not ask questions. He began with the music room, its breach, its history, its weight, then the metronome, ticking though unwound, then the score, annotated not just by Sir Hugo, but by a second hand. The fragments began to assemble, not in revelation, but in inevitability, and still no one moved. He had not come to ask for a confession, he had come to make the silence impossible. He did not die violently, Battle said, the sentence soft as dust, but he did not die cleanly. They did not speak, that was expected. There were no wounds, no bruises, no abrasions, only the blood beneath the collar, not dramatic, but present, and the brandy. He let that rest for a moment, not to see the reaction, he did not need it, but to allow the memory to catch up with the fact. It contained digitalis, in small quantity, but concentrated, enough, taken by a man with known cardiac weakness, to push the balance. Still no voice broke the silence, only Lady Agnes shifted, her eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in grim acknowledgment. The mention of the drug had not startled her. The death was declared natural, the family accepted it. The music room was closed, nothing disturbed, except, of course, the smell, the scent of jasmine. It remained. His gaze moved, almost imperceptibly, to Delia. She did not flinch. The coroner's report, unremarkable, if one wishes to see only what one expects, a heart that stopped, but not of its own accord. Battle drew a breath, shallow and even. There was no struggle, no confrontation, only preparation, and a hand that poured the glass, not in rage, not in panic, but with clarity. No one asked how he knew. That, too, had become irrelevant. What mattered was this: Sir Hugo had died in comfort, in trust, in silence, and because of that, no one had noticed how unnatural the silence had been. Delia's expression did not shift as her name remained unspoken but present, pressed into the air like a watermark. Her hands rested on her knees, ringless and poised, as though waiting for a conductor's cue that would never come. Battle continued, without judgment. He had begun rewriting the will, whether finished or not. The intention was known to one or two of you, perhaps all. But what he did not make known, or perhaps what he left deliberately incomplete, was the manner in which that inheritance would speak. He turned now, gently, toward Caroline. Her face was still, unreadable. She met his gaze only once, then looked back at her hands. Battle did not name her. He did not need to. To one he gave music, to the other, legacy. It was not an equal gesture, nor, perhaps, a kind one, but it was his, and it was known. Delia's shoulders remained square, but a line had formed at her throat, as if a note caught mid-bar. He chose not the performer, Battle said, but the listener, not the prodigy, but the echo. The silence, when it came, was not broken. It settled, low and final. Delia rose, not with defiance, not with theatre, only with the weary grace of someone who has lived too long with something unspeakable. She said nothing, but in her eyes the truth had already been acknowledged, not in admission, but in relief. The drawing-room by then had taken on the hush of aftermath, the peculiar stillness that follows not disaster, but understanding, the kind of silence that does not seek to be filled, but to be endured. Battle did not prolong it. He spoke again, calmly, without charge or flourish. There is no record of Delia purchasing digenesis, but she knew its use. It had once been prescribed to her mother. She had spoken of it herself, long ago, in a letter to a friend, and it was always in the house. The words did not provoke, not a gasp, not a movement. Delia sat still, her posture so composed it seemed inherited. It was never about hatred, Battle said, gently, nor about money. It was about a place once given, and then withdrawn. She had been raised to believe she was singular, not simply gifted, but essential. And when Sir Hugo shifted his centre, quietly, without ceremony, he dismantled more than expectation, he undermined identity. The fire had gone out, but the scent of ash lingered faintly. Lady Agnes stirred, but said nothing. She had loved him, but not as daughter, not as niece, as muse, and that position, unspoken, elevated, dangerous, cannot be shared. There was no accusation in his tone, no moral weight, only the steadiness of observation. He gave her the music, yes, but he withheld the intimacy of authorship. He had written for her, taught her, praised her, but never let her inside the composition. Not fully, not until the end, when he passed the pen. Battle paused. That was the betrayal. Delia's head tilted slightly, the barest movement, not in defiance, but in recognition. And so she did what any disciple might do when faith becomes unbearable. She ended the source. Not in rage, not in cruelty, but in order, because disorder would have made her less. It was not a justification, nor was it condemnation. It was simply the shape of a truth too long misread. Delia rose slowly, not with shame, but with a kind of careful finality. Her face was pale, her expression composed, as though all that had just been spoken had been long rehearsed within the privacy of her mind. "I never meant it to be dramatic," she said, her voice quiet, clipped. "He died peacefully. That was important." No one responded. Caroline sat still, her eyes lowered. Edward stared at the carpet, his face unreadable. Lady Agnes looked, for the first time, quite old. Delia walked to the hearth, and placed one hand lightly on the mantelpiece. She did not look at Battle. Her gaze was directed inward, not evading, but reflecting. "He would have destroyed the draft eventually," she said. "He always doubted himself at the end, always rewrote, retracted. I did him a kindness. It was not pride, it was certainty, the kind born of years spent living within the confines of another's genius. I knew the dose," she added, "knew it would be quiet. He wouldn't struggle, he'd just stop, like the final note held a little too long, and no one would think to ask why." Battle said nothing. She turned to him, and her voice, though still steady, bore the faintest trace of weariness. "I loved him, you understand that, don't you?" He inclined his head, the movement small, not indulgent, but real. Delia exhaled. "Then I've said enough." And with that she stepped back and waited, not to flee, not to fight, but to leave. Battle lingered after the others had gone, the metronome, still resting on the piano's lid, had ceased ticking hours ago, its pendulum frozen mid-arc. He approached it without ceremony, and examined it again, not for what it showed, but for what it had said. It had been set deliberately, not merely wound, but placed where it would be seen, not by the family, not by servants, but by someone who knew rhythm, who listened first and spoke later. He tilted it slightly, and let the pendulum fall. It did not resume. It was hers, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else, her tempo, her exit. The metronome had marked not a rehearsal, but a ritual, a last gesture from one who understood that the end of music must come not in crescendo, but in silence. He closed the piano lid with care. Nothing more was needed. The note had been played. The door to the music room was closed without audience, without instruction, without remark. The act itself passed quietly, as though it had occurred many times before, and would occur again in some other time, for some other grief. It was not Battle who did it, nor Edward, nor Lady Agnes. Rather it was the butler, with a key already in hand, though no one had spoken it into being, who stepped forward and turned the lock. No announcement followed. No one looked up. It was not the closing of a crime scene, nor a shrine. It was simply, finally, the acknowledgment of something finished. Lady Agnes, in her chair by the window, neither approved nor protested. Her hands were folded, her gaze remote. Edward paced once, twice, then stood still. Caroline did not speak. Her eyes remained on the floorboards, as though tracing old steps or waiting for music that would not come. No word passed among them, yet in that pause, brittle and suspended, there came a sensation of balance restored, not perfectly, but sufficiently. The tremor in the house seemed for the first time to recede. Battle remained by the hearth, silent. His role was done, and he knew it. The rest was theirs to carry, or not. Outside, the late afternoon held. The air moved gently, not quite a wind. Inside, the lock clicked once, cleanly, and then the key was returned to its hook, and no one asked for it again. The piano lid had been left open, neither invitation nor warning. Caroline entered without hesitation. The room no longer resisted her. Its long-kept tension had dissolved into a species of stillness that was neither heavy nor light, merely empty, like a chair just vacated. The scent of jasmine had faded. Dust had begun to settle in earnest. The metronome sat inert, its pendulum at peace. She took her place at the instrument, with a movement that was neither reverent nor mechanical. It had been a long time since she had played without instruction, without observation, perhaps ever. Her hands hovered a moment before descending. The opening chords of Threnody for silence did not echo, they absorbed. It was not a piece composed to dazzle. It was built on absence, on phrases that withdrew as soon as they arrived. The melody barely rose. It circled instead, pausing at intervals that felt longer than they were, resolving not into harmony, but into a kind of understanding. Caroline played without flourish. Each note, once struck, vanished cleanly, unchased. There was no audience. The door behind her remained ajar. The family scattered elsewhere in the house, neither intruded nor listened, and yet somehow the entire house held its breath. There was a passage midway, the one Hugo had rewritten, again and again, and Caroline played it as she had once imagined it might be, uncorrected, unbroken, hers. She did not weep, but as the final chord settled, neither sharp nor soft, her eyes closed, and her hands fell to her lap. She did not touch the keys again. The piece had been played, once, and only once, and so the final note faded, not with thunder, but with grace, as if the house itself had exhaled something long held in silence, But was Delia the only composer of this tragedy, or merely the last to play from a score written years before? What do you think truly drove her? Love, pride, or something deeper still? Let me know in the comments. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who loves quiet puzzles and lingering shadows, and do subscribe for more tales that leave a question in the air long after the last page turns.